from Hawaii, in the flesh, let us all welcome Dr. Celia Bardwell-Jones.
Mabuhay and aloha! That has been, this introduction has been a wonderful introduction. It's been wonderful to be hosted by your professors, by your deans, by your department chairs of the philosophy division and the Department of Humanities. So I'm so thrilled to be here at University of the Philippines, Los Baños. I actually was born in the Philippines, in Quezon City. And this has been my first time back, coming back to the Philippines since I was born. So it's been a long time for me to be here. And it's taken such motivation and interest from the philosophy department here at UP Los Baños and to welcome me, to help me return. Because it is a type of return that we all go to when we think about ethics and when we think about the moral landscape of our lives. And so, in many ways, I wanted to think about this homecoming in the context of our identity. How do we know ourselves in this world? And so when I started writing this particular essay, I was inspired by many of the Native Hawaiian traditions in Hawaii, particularly birthing practices. And so my paper is framed around looking at moral dilemmas within that context of birthing practices. And so I'm going to read to my paper, and I hope that we can have a conversation about it, because we all came, right, from some mother's womb, and we all had, at some point in our lives, a placenta that was attached to our bodies, right? And so while we may not think of this as a moral and ethical issue, some of our social practices around birthing traditions invite us to think about larger ethical relationships that we may not have thought about. So let me begin. Feminist scholars studying gender in the Pacific have analyzed the conditions of Pacific Islander women with an acute analysis on how the intersections of gender, culture, colonization, and strategies of decolonization aid in framing the experiences of Pacific Islander women. Like many introduced Western institutions in Hawaii, medical practices in hospitals and clinics have been both criticized and welcomed among Pacific Islanders. Feminist anthropologists, such as Vicki Lucaire and Margaret Joly, have diagnosed these conflicting receptions to medical institutions in the Pacific Islands as a reliance on the problematic binary of modern and traditional medical care. According to Lucaire and Joly, the biomedical approach is usually associated with assumptions of the technological and the modern. The traditional approach is associated with assumptions of the indigenous and the natural. Consequently, these problematic binaries fail in assessing the experiences of Pacific Islander women and their expressions of agency, especially those who navigate their agencies within hospital settings. Moreover, this binary framework fails in cultivating culturally sensitive approaches that hospitals can utilize in making policy decisions related to the cultural requests of Native Hawaiian women. So what brought this issue up? Well, prior to 2006, in Hawaii, modern medicine has understood the placenta as industrial human waste, posing threats to public health. Hence, Placentas were never given back to the parents, but disposed under hospital protocols as biological human waste. They were incinerated. However, Native Hawaiians view the placenta with cultural significance, in which the placenta is cared for in respectful ways, involving ritual ceremonies and proper burial back to the earth, followed by a planting of a tree, symbolizing the child's connection back to the earth. These quote-unquote traditional methods have been trumped by concerns of public health perceived by a Western medical framework, resulting in the enforcement of certain hospital policies to withhold the placenta from Native Hawaiian mothers who made requests to their doctors. This issue became a controversial topic, ensuing in a legal battle that highlighted the confrontation when culture and medicine collide. In this presentation, I would like to examine the case of the placenta in Hawaii as an example of what Jose Medina characterizes as, quote, epistemic injustice, and attempt to disrupt the pervasive tradition and modern binaries that constitute the experiences of Native Hawaiians within the medical context. I critically examine the epistemological frameworks that justify the exclusion of cultural claims, particularly the cultural practices of caring for the placenta within hospital policies. Through an examination of Native Hawaiian epistemology, understood within the intertwined practices of placenta care, mothering, Hawaiian women's sexuality, the context of colonization, the aim of this presentation is to develop a more pluralistic epistemological framework that might be able to broaden the perspectives and change the ways in which hospitals understand the tension of public health and cultural concerns. So, the medicalization of Native Hawaiian culture and the epistemologically resistant placenta. Now, a woman's placenta becomes a contested site, which can be interpreted through various cultural lenses. The plight of women's placentas in Hawaii became known in 2005 when Native Hawaiians protested the state's declaration that the placenta tissue, quote, is an infectious waste. The Stibbard and the Nahalea couple from Hilo, Hawaii, requested their first child's placenta at Kaiser Medical Center. According to the reports, their doctor, quote, did not see a problem with the request. Later, Kaiser called and informed them that they would not be allowed to take home the placenta. According to the state health director, Chiomi Fukino, the Department of Health did not know placentas were leaving the hospitals until they looked at the rules and found that this practice was not at all permitted. What was the rationale? According to Fukino, quote, the controversial rules were drafted about 1988 or 1990 because of the national concerns about the HIV virus and other bloodborne diseases. They defined pathological waste, all human tissues, organs, and body parts removed during surgery and autopsy, as infectious waste, subject to management and disposal. So that was the policy. The medical enforcement of the policies for disposal of the placenta within hospital policies has traumatized many Hawaiian families. The Palehua and Krug family also waged a legal battle with the state through the Native Hawaiian Legal Corporation after the mother, while laboring with her child in the hospital, was given a letter stating that she could not take her placenta home. A lawsuit was filed and a temporary restraining order kept the placenta at the hospital. In this particular case, the placenta serves as a form of epistemological resistance, whose cultural significance is at odds within a modern technological hospital setting. While individual doctors have been sympathetic in allowing their patients to take their placentas home, a larger medical practice dictates the actions conducted within the hospital. Individual doctors have quietly determined the fate of the placenta by turning the other cheek thereby allowing a family member with a cooler, right, to sweep in and discreetly take the placenta off hospital premises. However, the undocumented nature of the placenta could not be concealed any further. The hospital found out, and obscure, antiquated rules needed to be enforced. This is when the placenta became an epistemological problem. Even after families were able to bring their placentas home, the cultural significance of the placenta remains concealed, as evidenced by the new state policy effective July 2007. So this is the new state policy in 2007. Upon negative findings of infection or hazard after appropriate testing of the mother by a healthcare facility or physician and confirmation of the findings on a release form established by the department, a placenta may be released by a healthcare facility or generator to the woman from which it originated or to the woman's designee. The placenta is not depicted as infectious waste or a biological hazard any longer, although it is highly policed by physicians, the healthcare facilities, and bureaucratic state forms. However, for my purpose in this essay, it is unclear what the significance of the placenta is that perplexes the medical establishment. Does the placenta have cultural standing in hospital settings? Do hospital administrators have to be more culturally sensitive to the community? Does this new law governing placentas affect how cultural values of birth, or even death, are understood within the larger medical establishment? The placenta seems to continue to be epistemologically ambiguous as further ethical questions emerge for hospitals to confront, especially hospitals that serve culturally diverse communities. So, the resistance of Native Hawaiian epistemology. This is the next section. Placental epistemological unease, right? It is an unease in hospital settings reveals an underlying conflict when Western and Indigenous frameworks of knowledge collide. It is clear that the placenta's cultural significance is concealed within the discourse and logic of a Western medical institution. Its resistance is represented as a failure to reveal its cultural intelligibility within the language of hospital policy. Bonnie Meyer's work in Native Hawaiian epistemology can perhaps illuminate the cultural intelligibility of the placenta. The main project of Meyer's work calls into question educational methodologies perpetuated by American missionaries in Hawaii. And I would say that that same colonial practice of education may have been replicated in the Philippines as well. And envisions a new, envisions new empowering epistemology that speaks to Hawaiian values and a culture within a Western education system. According to Meyer, since the time of Captain Cook's arrival in 1778, the Native Hawaiian population reached to numbers of 800,000 plus people. However, by 1893, the time of Queen Liliuokalani's overthrow, the population had diminished to 40,000 plus people. Meyer points out evidence during the time of the missionary golden years, around 1832, that many Native Hawaiian children were enrolled in school. Interestingly, the indigenous ruling class saw the power of Western education and communication among their people. Meyer directs us to a letter signed by members of the ruling class that sought out more teachers from America. Initially, Western knowledge was welcomed as it opened up new technologies that Hawaiians may be able to integrate within their cultural experience. For example, the printed word was introduced to Native Hawaiians as their culture integrated the written word into their oral cultural traditions. Hawaiians became mesmerized by these new ways of articulating their experience. According to Meyer, quote, reading and writing became lifelong passions for Hawaiians, close quote. It truly opened up a whole new way of relating to the world. While American colonial influence introduced new technologies for Hawaiians, the method of education never really spoke to the actual lives of Hawaiians. Meyer points out the formal structure of education rested upon foundations of, quote, benevolent disdain and compassionate indifference, close quote. The paternalism in many letters and diaries from missionaries demonstrated the, quote, irony and uncontrollable ignorance, quote, toward the lives of the Hawaiian people. And so for Meyer, the cultural collision of the Puritan missionaries and Hawaiian cultural values resulted in many Hawaiians feeling inferior while perceiving Western culture of the missionaries as superior. The effect of this cultural collision still, quote, reverberates across the Pacific. Now, Meyer's reconstruction of the Native Hawaiian epistemology is a richly woven analysis integrating John Dewey's theories of aesthetics and her own personal interviews with cultural mentors in Hawaii. She delves into theories of hermeneutics and provides an expansive vision of Hawaiian cultural practices and their philosophical meaning. But what I take important in her work in addressing an epistemology of resistance are two important claims: sensual knowledge of embodiment and knowledge of origins, specifically origins to one's place and environment. One of the most important epistemological themes in Meyer's writings is the importance of embodied knowledge through the senses. She argues that the colonial context alienates the knower from her body, from her senses. The first act of decolonization is to step back into our bodies and utilize the five senses. She refers to this move as cultural empiricism. Our senses are shaped culturally by the type of relationship we have with the world and the people. In this sense, Hawaiians are taught to hear, taste, and feel the ocean, sky, and earth. It is subtle, emotive, and rational, and is mediated by one's cultural and generational intelligence. Second, Native Hawaiian epistemology emphasizes knowledge of origins, specifically one's relationship to the environment. Meyer characterizes knowledge production as becoming intimate with nature and one's land because it is the environment that feeds them. Feeding becomes a way of understanding how the land, both metaphorically and literally, feeds the people. In this sense, the land directs, guides, encourages, and solicits the attention of the knower. The land provides a basis, a grounding to act in the world. It becomes a moral guide for action. For Meyer, quote, land, sky, and ocean also become the classroom of their most vivid lessons, the place of metaphors from which they continually draw. So sensual knowledge and environmental knowledge encourage knowers to seek connections with the land and people. It goes beyond a mere scientific empiricism, in which raw data is observed from natural phenomena and objectified in individual parts. This type of knowledge or intelligence connotes a moral relationship with the world. It is a visceral and sensual knowledge that is felt deep within the knower's body. The sensitivities that are cultivated within the knower's body are habitually developed through cultural practices such as taro farming, fishing, or voyaging. The body is attuned to the aina, to the land, through bodily practices of feeding the aina and engagements with the world. According to Meyer, sensual knowledge is a type of genetic memory, subtle, unseen, yet known intuitively, rationally, and a knowledge that can be tapped into when needed. Meyer points out that the Hawaiian word ike means to see, and also to know. It is a type of seeing that observes and recognizes patterns and relationships in the world, which knows and therefore teaches us how to behave. Ike is a conscious seeing that is filled with ideas of what is right and wrong, good and bad, according to Meyer. This type of epistemological lucidity goes beyond merely seeing the natural and social world for what they are within a scientific empiricist framework. Cultural empiricism can be understood as an epistemic and a moral orientation to the natural world, framed by embodied cultural practices and intimate interactions. it becomes a moral and epistemological lucidity framed by Hawaiian cultural values that is sensitive to one's relationship embedded within nature. The next section is Hawaiian mothers, women's sexuality, and the placenta. Since Hawaiian epistemology rests upon a framework of cultural empiricism, which involves embodied practices of knowing based on land, generational intelligence, and one's senses, it becomes clear as to why the placenta fails to be articulated in a Western medical establishment. In order to understand the significance of the placenta among Native Hawaiians, it is important to analyze how we interpret and come to understand Hawaiian women within a colonial context. Notions of motherhood, women's sexuality, connections to the land, and birthing and placental practices are rationally intertwined from a Native Hawaiian epistemological perspective. Hence, the history of colonization becomes the backdrop in understanding the cultural relation of the placenta within an American colonial context. So, Hawaiian women were understood as trapped within what's known as a type of double bind many women experience. And that double bind has been understood and framed within a Western patriarchal context of oppression. And so what I argue is that this type of patriarchal oppression has this legacy that has influenced dominant epistemology's understanding of sensuous and environmental knowledge. And so, for one thing, let me see here. Hawaiian women did not, for example, missionary women viewed Hawaiian mothers as irresponsible, allowing their children to run around and not providing adequate discipline. Moreover, they viewed the Hawaiian kinship structures as hindering the assimilation of values of American womanhood. Hawaiian women did not honor marriage bonds as much as they honored their roles with their family. And then mothering practices and their epistemologies were also deemed inadequate, and hence rejected by a colonial framework of knowing. Operating under a delusion that Hawaiian mothers were inadequate caretakers of their children, the colonial framework failed to see how mothering practices related to the care of the placenta represented a mother's duty and moral obligation. It's not surprising that the misrepresentation of the placenta in hospital policies follows age-old colonial patterns of misrepresenting Hawaiian mothers and their culture. The other representation of Hawaiian women were seen as sexually available and lustful, swimming to sailors' boats and seeking sexual relations. This male Western exoticization of Hawaiian women harkens back to Captain Cook's first arrival on the Hawaiian Islands. And so this has been a problem in understanding, again, how these ideals of womanhood interfere or at least determine the policies, these colonial policies at the hospital. So, let's see here. So, according to Ralston, many women, for example, canoed out to British ships and, quote, carefully deposited the navel cords of recently born children in the crevices of small holes of the ships. Ralston points out that parents who wanted their children to travel would drop the umbilical cord at sea. The umbilical cord is known as the piko. Ralston, citing Mary Kavena Pukui, a modern expert on Hawaiian practices, noted that Hawaiians thought Captain Cook was the god Lono and viewed his ship as the floating island. Placing her child's piko on the ship would create an opportunity to ensure the well-being of the child. And so in this case, colonial epistemology failed to see the role of Native Hawaiian women's sexuality tied to their mothering sense of duty and moral obligation of the placental and piko care that links their child to the environment and larger community. And so what I argue here is that these two damaging figures of Hawaiian women obscured and helped contribute to rendering the placenta epistemologically invisible. They could not understand how to see the importance of placental care. So, at a recent World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education held in Honolulu, Hawaii in 2014, I attended a panel on birthing practices in Hawaii. Discussion during the panel revealed that many Hawaiian and Maori women seek a biculturalism within hospital settings, such that their cultural practice of keeping the placenta can be honored. So for many Pacific Islanders, it's not rejecting modern care, right, hospital care, but it's more or less how these modern medical institutions may be able to incorporate the cultural sensitivities and values of the people they serve, the indigenous populations they serve. And now it is important to note that even within these hospital settings, Native Hawaiians employ an epistemology that challenges the traditional modern binary. Now, keeping Meyer's theories of Native Hawaiian epistemology in view, sensual and environmental knowledge help frame the cultural significance of the placenta in Hawaii. Customs surrounding the placenta ensure the child's and mother's well-being and establish a connection between the mother, child, people, and place. Fundamentally, the placenta serves as the mother-child relation to the community. In this sense, childbirth is not just an act that is individually accomplished by an independent mother, but must be understood as a community process, marking the birth of a new member into a community. According to Mary Kavena Pukui, quote, the placenta, or ieve, was always washed and usually buried under a tree. Failure to wash it caused the baby to have sore, weak eyes. The tree under which the placenta was buried became property of the child. Some people buried it to one side of the trail or in some other place where it could not be disturbed, close quote. Pukui further elaborates on the importance of the placenta, indicating that the tree the placenta is planted under is the property of the child because it is thought to keep the child close to home, even throughout his or her adult life. Pukui states, quote, or yet, more mystically, to ensure that the child's spirit, after death, would never become that homeless, hungry, wandering spirit, right, called ao kueva, or the realm of exile. For contemporary cultural Hawaiian practitioners, the ritual of the planting of the ieve, the placenta, is a sacred and secret ceremony. The purpose of the ceremony is to bind the child to her homeland. It serves as a moral guide for the child as her ethical responsibilities to the land are shaped by a placental connection to the earth. According to Dr. Kame'eli Hiba, a professor of Hawaiian Studies at the University of Hawaii, if the placenta is planted in the earth, which in our religion is our grandmother Papahana Moku, the child will remain tied to the land of Hawaii, will not stray far, and will work hard on behalf of the land. If the placenta is disposed in a rubbish heap, the child will act like rubbish and be antisocial. In this sense, the moral virtue of the child is dependent on the proper care of the placenta. Understanding the placenta as biological waste already places the child in a moral crisis throughout its life, his or her, their life. The placenta must be thought of along with the history of colonization in Hawaii, the missionary zeal in valuing ideals of American womanhood, and the Western fantasy that depicts Hawaiian women's sexuality as lustful and promiscuous. These are colonial legacies that have served to promote and help perpetuate certain blind spots and misunderstandings of the birthing tradition in Hawaii. The placenta is concealed but interwoven within the entanglements of the ideals of motherhood, public health, and the modern technological assumptions related to hospital births. So, while the placenta evokes unease in hospital settings, it is nonetheless important, if not essential, for hospital administrations to value claims of cultural sensitivity, especially in culturally diverse communities of Hawaii. One way of responding to the clash of cultural claims is to advocate for the biomedical approach, which relies on an assumption of epistemological superiority, especially over claims of culture. The value of public health and the concomitant standards of science objectivity has historically been epistemologically supported politically in Western institutions. Hence, when public health is perceived as threatened, especially in the context of antiquated hospital policies governing, quote, human biological waste, the biomedical approach is narrowly cast as rejecting requests of cultural claims. Cultural claims are cast as distinct, separate, and oftentimes barbaric to the standards of Western medical policies. Hospital administrations may at times forget that claims to public health must be contextualized within the community they serve. Another alternative to the biomedical approach is a community-oriented model, one that takes seriously the cultural claims of the community as a check or counterpoint to the blind spots of modern medicine. Jose Medina's powerful work on the epistemology of resistance provides an important model in addressing questions of cultural diversity within a colonial context, and can help carve out what a community-oriented response would look like. Oppressed identities, much like Native Hawaiians, have been socially positioned in the context of oppression and hence develop an epistemological lucid vantage point, such that they are able to see beyond what is normalized by a dominant society. So there are two parts of Medina's work that I just want to quickly highlight. One of the central claims in Medina's work is concerned with epistemic injustices. One of the ways in which epistemic injustices emerge is through the development of cultural blind spots or insensitivities. Similar to Meyer, the visual paradigm is affected in both literally seeing patterns and relationships in the world, as well as knowing the unseen moral relationships that occur beyond the sight. According to Medina, cultural insensitivities are often created through cognitive habits that cultivate ignorance. In other words, those in privileged positions, such as hospital administrators, may see particular aspects of the world, but don't know in the unseen interpersonal moral sense what also is constitutive of the world. The placenta might be seen as biological waste, but it is not known in a moral and interpersonal sense as a connection to one's community. So developing virtuous epistemic habits would involve interacting with epistemic resistance. While resistance might imply external pressure to one's subjectivity, it is a mistake to think that it is merely experienced as an outward occurrence. And so, to connect this up with Native Hawaiian epistemology, sensual and environmental knowledge involve an interaction between the knower and the knower, the subject and the object. Hence, epistemic resistance should be seen as a fluid epistemological process cultivating virtuous habits of knowing. And so it might involve confronting a way of knowing that is completely different from one's own epistemological frameworks. And Jose Medina borrows a concept from Jane Addams, an American philosopher, and she understands this process of perplexity, right? That for Addams, perplexity cannot be thought of in an impersonal sense as apprehending a logical contradiction, right? But more as someone's personal involvement in a situation, right? It's beyond like, going through a logic equation and saying, here's modus ponens, and so it's true. But a perplexed situation gives us this kind of like, what's going on here? What's happening here in an interpersonal and moral sense? And Jane Addams highlights this social dimension of a perplexed situation, and that it's important to note that these interpersonal sensitivities are responding to these external forces. So, like if someone is in a perplexed situation, it occurs in an embodied sense. Something doesn't feel right. Something is out of balance. Perplexity alerts us physically and emotionally to the blind spots of our more familiar epistemological frameworks. Another central theme Medina highlights is the epistemic traits of acknowledging a perplexed situation, and that it encourages a sense of epistemic humility, a desire to cultivate intellectual curiosity and the diligence to see the situation in multiple perspectives. So in other words, when one confronts a perplexed situation, one doesn't try to assert a kind of epistemological dominance to seek certainty, right? But one approaches that perplexed situation within a perspective of humility, right? Epistemic humility. And this is where we can see alternative epistemologies come into play. Which gets me into my last section here, that new epistemologies, embodied epistemologies can emerge. The traditional and modern binary has served to frame the experiences of Hawaiian women in hospital settings. While hospitals represent a legacy of colonial attitudes, modern approaches to healthcare are perceived as opening up more options to better serve the needs of Hawaiian communities. And so it is important to note that resistant imaginations require being open to the social context and being flexible enough to adjust one's epistemic framework in order to concretely address the concerns of the wider community. And so this is an epistemic skill that Medina argues. And so the discourse surrounding the placenta in hospitals serves as a locus point in developing a kaleidoscopic social sensibility, according to Medina, in addressing the concerns of public health and cultural safety in the hospitals, serving the birth communities. Now, it should be evident by now that the placenta wasn't really the problem prior to 2006 in the state of Hawaii. Concerns of public health overshadowed the discourse surrounding the placenta, which framed the epistemic vantage point of public health officials. During the legal battles and the public statements made by many Native Hawaiian families and hospital administrators, the placenta troubled the epistemological frameworks of the Western medical context. How should hospital administrators understand this organic tissue? How does one truly know the ontological status of this lump of flesh that had served to nourish the baby? Is it biological waste or a sacred spiritual connection of the child to the wider community to which she belongs? Caring for the placenta involves a clash of epistemological methods between public health and cultural safety. And so, what I'd like to do is to see the placenta as more than excess fleshly matter of the mother's body. Right? But from a Native Hawaiian epistemological perspective, it establishes the infant's early moral relationship with the land and her people. The placenta rituals bind the infant in a personal relationship with her community. The placenta represents the embodied dimension of this epistemology. And beyond mere metaphor, the placenta is essentially experienced as an extension of the animate earth. And so in this sense, birth cannot be viewed as an individual process that a single mother experiences. This individual model that is pervasive in hospital policies deems the placenta as separate or in excess of the mother's body. So the planting of the placenta signifies a sense of place, a concrete and sensual place that the infant is always bound to. Place becomes a foundational tenet in Native Hawaiian epistemology. And so, now it is inevitable that healthcare policies are largely informed by a state of moral panic that generally surrounds the interest of public health. Health policies are supposed to be concerned with disease and contagion, which may affect the larger community. However, blind spots are inevitable when the safety of the public is the concern. In the case of providing adequate care for the placenta after birth in a hospital, it is important to recognize how antiquated policies need to be revised. And so what I was thinking of as an alternative, a community-oriented approach, would be to incorporate embodied habits and cultivate an openness to perplexity, particularly toward the land. And so one suggestion could be to allow the earth to be the classroom, as Meyer suggests, It is not through sitting in a closed office seminar room engaging health policy administrators to take cultural sensitivity training classes, but perhaps actually developing an embodied habit of being open to a variety of cultural perspectives related to health. Meyer has suggested that she learned more in doing projects with Native Hawaiians such that she was able to articulate and distinct Native Hawaiian epistemologies. Perhaps that is what is needed in healthcare and administration. Epistemological virtues and habits that need to be taught through daily practice and action. Working closely with the diverse communities through shared projects or community service can encourage hospitals and healthcare policy administrators to become open to perplexity and resistance such that their epistemological horizons cultivate humility and intellectual curiosity about the various ways in which people view health. And so placental ethics in this presentation, it aims to rethink the conditions of knowledge in hospital settings in Hawaii. Though the issue of the placenta in Hawaii has been resolved in 2006, thereby allowing the cultural practice of taking home the placenta, it remains unclear how to conceive of cultural safety in hospital administration. The placenta serves as an instance of epistemological unease and perplexity, as well as a sign to take the necessary pause for ethical reflection. And one example comes from Kokua Kalihi Valley. It's a medical center on the island of Hawaii, and its aim is to bridge the community and the hospital administration together, right? So hospital policies are more in line with the community needs. And so part of the skills needed for hospital administration to consider is to develop better epistemological approaches to guide hospital policies, and that this could be achieved by adopting an engaged and embodied epistemological framework that is open to the perplexities of the community. And I think I'll end there because there's more to be said about placental ethics, I hope, in our conversation.